Peace be upon you. So anyone who's been listening to the podcast for a while would realize that I rarely talk about topical issues. Usually I like to stick to timeless principles that are pulled from the Quran that inshallah someone 10 years from now can go back and listen to and still be able to benefit from. And I avoid things that are in the news cycle. Sometimes I'll talk about the general theme without ever addressing the actual news topic. But this time I feel is different. I wanted to address specifically the Black Lives Matter movement and look at this through the lens of the Quran. So let's start by looking at the concept of racism. God strongly prohibits racism. Actually, the first racist we have is that of Satan. When God created Adam and he asked all the angels to prostrate before Adam, Satan refused. And when God questioned Satan to why he refused to prostrate before Adam, the response he gave, he said, "I am better than he. You created me from fire and you created him from clay." And there we have the first racist, an individual who thought that just because of his makeup, that he was a better individual than someone else. Not because of his character, not because of his morality, but strictly because of the contents of what he was made. And this is the foundation of racism. Anyone who's a racist today, who basically despises someone else because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity, is no better than Satan. They're following in the same footsteps as Satan. In Surah 49 verse 13, it reads, "O people, we created you from the same male and female and rendered you distinct peoples and tribes that you may recognize one another. The best among you in the sight of God is the most righteous. God is omniscient, cognizant." God is telling us the criteria by which we judge has nothing to do with the color of one's skin, has nothing to do with the tribe by which they come from, has nothing to do with their ethnicity. What matters is the character and their morality, and ultimately their righteousness. That's the metric by which we should judge individuals. How righteous are they? How good of an individual are they? How kind are they? In Surah 30 verse 22 it reads, "Among his proofs are the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the variations in your languages and your colors. In these there are signs for the knowledgeable." So God is informing us this is part of God's beautiful design, that we have these variations in our languages, in our colors, in our cultures. And this is something to be celebrated. But rather than use this as a sign, some people use this as a way to isolate people, to discriminate against people. And this goes completely against the Quran. Now the question is, what do we do when you have an ideology that contradicts what we have in the Quran? It is our duty that we uphold the Quran. It doesn't matter how good the ideology sounds, we always uphold the Quran. In Surah 5 verse 48 it reads, "And we revealed to you this scripture truthfully, confirming previous scriptures and superseding them. You shall rule among them in accordance with God's revelations, and do not follow their wishes if they differ from the truth that has come to you." So God is telling us that under no circumstances can we deviate from the message and the ruling and the source of law that God provides for us in the Quran. Now what happens is, we get a lot of arguments that sound appealing on the surface. They sound emotional, and our heart is telling us that yes, we need to basically support these causes. But when you scratch below the surface, what you realize is that these premises completely contradict the foundations of the Quran. We have something known as Godwin's law. And what Godwin's law is that when social media first became popular, this individual realized that hey, there's no possible way two people can have an argument on social media without one party eventually resorting to comparing the other party to Hitler or Nazis or the Third Reich or something of that sort. And the question is why? Why is that? It's because we've all identified universally that these are the epitome of evil. Therefore, if I can equate someone as Hitler or Nazi or some other of these depictions, then I've automatically taken the moral high ground. The problem in that is that these individuals were completely heinous. Hitler killed millions of innocent individuals. He was the epitome of everything evil. And when we start equating anyone who has a difference of understanding than us as a Nazi or Hitler, we're really doing a disservice to just how disgusting of an individual this person was. And we shouldn't use these terms lightly. When we call each other racist because, we have a difference of understanding on some data or some topic, it just goes to show that these words are losing their meaning. And this is actually something that George Orwell in his book 1984 warned about. Consistently, when people are able to take over language, to allow words to mean new things, then all of a sudden we lose the foundation by which we can communicate. In 1984, the book, there's a concept known as doublethink. Doublethink is a process of indoctrination whereby the subject is expected to accept as true that which is clearly false, or to simultaneously accept two mutually contradictory beliefs as correct. When this happens, we lose that foundation because these words that have certain meanings, all of a sudden they mean the opposite of what they actually mean. When each individual can be targeted and isolated and called a racist or compared to Hitler or Nazis, then all of a sudden all conversation stops. And there's another term from the book 1984, it's called doublespeak. Doublespeak is the language that deliberately obscures, disguises, distorts, or reverses the meanings of words. So rather than it meaning what you would think it means on the surface level, you realize that it actually means the opposite. So in the book, the Ministry of Love was the department that used force to force individuals to love their big brother. And big brother was kind of the government in this. The Ministry of Peace was actually the Department of War. The Ministry of Truth was actually the Department of Propaganda. So if someone said, I'm against the Ministry of Truth, if you heard that on the surface level, you'd say, oh wow, what a terrible person. He must hate truth. But what you realized was the Ministry of Truth was actually the Department for Propaganda. So by saying, I hate the Ministry of Truth, what they're actually saying is, I hate propaganda. But again, from the surface level, this is lost meaning. Now, what does this have to do with Black Lives Matter? The question is, we have the namesake Black Lives Matter, which everyone is in agreement for. To say that one life is better than another is completely erroneous. It's terrible. So no one is ever going to object to the statement, do Black Lives matter? Absolutely they matter. But the question is that what the movement is propagating? Because what the namesake says versus what their actual objectives are at odds with one another. And I'll try to give an example. Imagine I create a movement, or someone creates a movement, a group of people, and they call it Human Lives Matter. And the reasoning for creating this movement is because they say, look, each year, and this is a true stat, 250,000 people die because of medical error. This is about 10% of all deaths in the United States are caused because of medical error. So they create a campaign and they say human lives matter. Who's going to be against that campaign? No one. Because everyone agrees that this is a problem. Everyone agrees that this needs to be addressed, that there's ways to improve the situation. But what if you dig a little deeper and say, okay, I understand human lives matter, but what do you want to do? What is it that you want to achieve? And what you find out is that their objective is to defund hospitals, is to end doctors from being in official practice, is to promote violence to further their cause, or to tear down the entire healthcare system to rebuild in a new version. Once you hear that, you realize like, oh, wow. What the Human Lives Matter movement wants to do is fundamentally at odds with the actual human lives that they claim they want to support. BLM is doing the exact same thing. On the surface, if you look at the namesake, Black Lives Matter, again, everyone is going to agree with that statement. But when you start digging in to see what is it that their objective is, how do they want to create this, new vision to show the world that yes, Black Lives Matter, you realize that this is literally a Marxist revolution. It has nothing to do with the well-being of Black lives. I'm going to actually argue that it does the opposite. That what they're doing is propagating certain changes in society that are going to be to the direct detriment of Black lives and every American at that. If you look at the background on the three co-founders of BLM, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, these individuals are self-proclaimed Marxist revolutionaries. In one interview, Patrisse Cullors, she says that her and Alicia, so someone was asking a question. They said, hey, there's some people think that you're not up for the task for driving this movement. And she reassures these individuals that no, she is a trained Marxist. She's trained in their ideologies, that she knows the tactics she needs to uphold in order to propagate this movement. And okay, so she's identifying as a trained Marxist. Opal Tometi, another one of the three co-founders, in 2015, she was in Venezuela helping them with their elections. Here's a tweet. This is from December 3rd, 2015. You can go to her Twitter account and it reads, currently in Venezuela, such a relief to be in a place where there's intelligent political discourse. Keep in mind, this is when Obama was in office. This has nothing to do with Trump. This is when Obama was in office. She's in Venezuela praising Maduro an individual who has killed countless people, who's stolen the property, the private property of millions of individuals. Venezuela used to be one of the most prosperous societies on the planet. When they started implementing their Marxist revolution, all of a sudden they are one of the most poorest individuals on this planet. Their people are starving on the streets. They have no food. They have no security. They're in continuous, perpetual violence. And she's praising this country. These are the people who are founding Black Lives Matter. They are self-proclaimed atheist, homosexual, Marxist revolutionaries. And these are the ones who are propagating this movement. So when someone says, look, I'm 100% for Black lives, I am not for the Black Lives Matter movement, because what they are propagating, again, is at the detriment to Black Americans and Americans at large. So I want to get into these specifics. The first thing that they propagate when you look at Black Lives Matter movement, their first cause, and there's a reason for this, is to defund the police. Now, most people, when you say, hey, look, this is a terrible idea, they say, no, you're misunderstanding. What they actually want is to reform the police. But that is not what they're protesting for. They literally want to defund the police. Defund means to prevent from continuing to receive funds. It does not mean reform, reallocate. These are things that other individuals can agree upon. But what the protesters, these founders, want is to specifically abolish the police department. Now, why is it that they want to do this? It's because they realize the first line of defense in order to be able to successfully have an overthrow of the government is to be able to eliminate the police department. If they can eliminate the police department, the chances of the US military coming and creating order is going to be virtually impossible. Militaries are not good for these kind of tactics. They're good for war. For things that are happening inside civilian society, militaries are horrendous. If you want any proof of this, look at how the militaries performed every time we've gone into another country. Iraq, Afghanistan, it's an utter nightmare. The US military is absolutely terrible at such a thing. So they know if they can eliminate the police, if they can abolish the police, then they can have their opportunity in order to overthrow the government. And again, if there's any doubt that these individuals want to abolish the police, here's a op-ed from the New York Times from Mariam Kaba, who's the co-founder of Chicago BLM movement. So Chicago BLM is one of the largest BLM groups in the country. And in her op-ed, she says, this is the headline, yes, we mean literally abolish the police. And you look at her work, she has so much books written on this concept that she believes that police departments are the reason of the downfall of society. And she wants them abolished. And it's not just her. In the protest, when in Minneapolis, they had the mayor, Jacob Fry, come because they went to his house and he came out and they said, Jacob, will you defund the police? And they said, let me be clear. We want no more police. We want no more people with guns. And when Jacob Fry said, I'm not for abolishing the police, he got booed by thousands and thousands of protesters saying, go home, Jacob, go home. This is to say that, no, what they actually mean is to reform is an utter lie. And what happens when you defund the police? We see a little glimpse of this. And it's really sad. In Chicago this past weekend, this is Father's Day weekend, there were 104 shootings of individuals. 14 people were murdered, including a 3-year-old child. Now you think when the police department is so heavily tied up dealing with protesters, dealing with rioters, dealing with looters, and on top of that, they're so demoralized because the whole society now hates them, has painted them as these terrible individuals, these racist individuals, then what happens is that there's chaos in society. 14 murders in a single weekend. The previous weekend, this is from May 29th to June 1st, there were 25 people who were killed in Chicago alone. This was the bloodiest weekend in Chicago's 60-year history. So in 60 years since they've had such a bloody outcome, 85 people wounded by gunfire. This is what happens when you defund the police. You have chaos. You have absolute warfare on the street. So these individuals who want to propagate to defund the police, you look, they've caused more death to African Americans than the unfortunate unarmed shooting that police have caused in any year, just in these 2 weekends in this one location. And individuals, they say, look, Camden, New Jersey is an example. I don't know if you guys have seen this. They say it's an example of what defund the police looks like. And this is such an utter propagandist lie. Camden, New Jersey, you can go look at the Wikipedia page. What happened was their union, the police union, this is a big problem with the police departments, that they're heavily unionized. Union, by its very nature, it basically protects their worst workers, meaning you have individuals who are terrible. Let's say they're racist. They're just tons of complaints against them. The union protects these individuals because they lack individual accountability under the structure of a union. And it's not limited to police departments. You see this in teacher unions. You see this in unions and government workers. This is an inherent problem with unions. So in 2011, the Camden Police Department was in talks with the county because they wanted $60 million in funding, and they were saying that's way too much because at that time they were one of the highest ranking murder locations in the country. And they felt like, look, there's no way we're going to pay you this much money based on the results you're having. So when the negotiations halted in January 2011, Camden laid off 168 of 370 police officers. The next 2 years, 2011 and 2012, were the bloodiest years in Camden's history. It's because the police straight up just stopped. They said at sometimes there was as little as 12 officers who were patrolling at a time. And you can guarantee these officers were not motivated to actually put themselves in the risk of harm to stopping any crime. In 2010, there were 37 murders. Okay, so that's terrible. But in 2011, when the police department cut their force by 168 people, it skyrocketed to 52 murders. Then in 2012, there was 70 murders. The death toll was so horrific that activists created a field of crosses in front of Camden City Hall, planning a new one for each of the murder victims. This is what happens when you defund the police. Just like what we're seeing in Chicago right now, is that when you have lawlessness and you have a society that has more guns than there are people, individuals end up killing each other. And this is what these people want. They want to defund the police. They want to eliminate the police. It's not because they want the protection of African Americans or Americans at large. It's because they want a revolution. And it wasn't until 2013 that they re-established the police department under the Camden County Police Department. And the only change that really took place was that this new police department wasn't unionized. So therefore their costs were lower and they could actually fund more police. And these police still have guns to date, and also more programs to help the people in that society. So what we saw, the defunding of the police actually led to skyrocketing of deaths, skyrocketing into murders and lawlessness. And it wasn't until the police was re-established under the deunionized manner that you actually saw crime start to decrease. This is completely in line with Marxist ideology. In Marxism, there is no police. People are supposed to all live in utopia, hand in hand, and it's a complete utopian fabrication. It's not going to happen. We see consistently what happens when you eliminate police departments within a society. You get lawlessness. Go across the border, go to Mexico, go to Colombia, and you see the number of killings because the police department, there's no incentive for them to actually police. Individuals, they vastly underestimate how small of a subset of a population you need to really overthrow a government. And in Nazi Germany, this is for perspective, in 1933, they only had 2 million members. And that's about 3% of the population that was affiliated with the Nazi Party. At the peak of the Nazi Party in 1945, they only had 8 million members. That only equates to 10% of the population. And if you compare that, so you say, look, 10% of the population was actually avidly part of the Nazi Party. How many people were complacent? Probably a decent amount. You look at the Islamic Revolution in 1979 in Iran. The Islamic Party had 2.5 million members, only 6.7% of the total population. Yet they had mass support from the individuals. And what we see right now is that in a poll, I believe it was Pew Research, that roughly 2/3 of Americans support the BLM movement. Now, how could they possibly support something that, again, at the core of its foundation is at the detriment to the lives of African Americans, that it's to the detriment of the lives of the very people who quote unquote support this? Now, there's a term in communist talk that's called a useful idiot. A useful idiot is an individual who is propagating a cause without fully understanding the goals of that cause, let alone who are the leaders and what are their motivations. That these people just jump on the bandwagon. They say, hey, this sounds great. We're for Black Lives Matter. Let me go out on the street and cause havoc and destruction, not realizing that what they're doing is propagating the very source of their future destruction. And it's sad that that's what 2/3 of America are falling for. That again, they look at the namesake and they don't stop to ask, what is the actual objective of this? The problem is not just the defunding of the police. This is just one of them. This is the core mission. And again, the reason they want to do that is because that's going to give them the strongest foothold to the next step of their movement. And we see this is from the Black Lives Matter website itself, as far as what is it that their movement is propagating. And you realize very little of it has to do with the well-being of Black lives. So this is one of the points. This is we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. Keep in mind, these individuals, these self-identified, queer, atheist, Marxists, this is their utopian vision, that you destroy the nuclear family. You do not have a husband, a wife, children, a strong bond, that they are now raised in a collective. And this is completely at odds with the Quran. The Quran constantly ascribes that a family is essential, that the husband and the wife, that God actually abhors this divorce, that we do everything in order to support one another, to maintain this unity, to maintain this nuclear bond. But these individuals, they're against that. And what happens to a society that all of a sudden you destroy the nuclear family? We actually saw this after the civil rights movement with the welfare state. And it's really sad, but anyone who's studied the matter realizes that propagating welfare was actually to the detriment of Black communities. The number of marriages that took place prior to the civil rights movement was higher than post the civil rights movement. And the reason they believe this is because welfare actually incentivized individuals to not stay married, because they would get more support if they had a broken family. And you think about what happens to a society after generations that is incentivized not to stay together. And it's sad, but the number of fathers who are absent in Black families compared to what it was prior to civil rights, prior to the welfare state, is really a gross injustice. And we saw that after welfare came out and then the divorce rate skyrocketed and kids out of wedlock became higher. What else took place? We see skyrocketing rates of abortion among African American communities. Margaret Sanger, her objective, she's the founder of Planned Parenthood, was to sterilize the races that she deemed unfit to breed. And these were predominantly African Americans. I won't even repeat some of her comments because they are so offensive. You know, the long-term consequences of growing up in a single-family home, we discussed this in the previous podcast about abortion. You know, I believe it's like 80% of people in prison came from single-family homes, right? Drug abuse is way higher in single-family home. And this idea that all of a sudden we're going to all be one huge family, everyone cares for someone, it's tried time and time again, and it always fails. This is something that, again, it works only in Marxist literature, but we never see it occur in reality. And the sad thing is that it's these kind of these policies that they're propagating only end up hurting themselves. And we saw this. So say, for instance, you see that there's a video that circulates around. It shows someone that is, being brutally attacked, who's African American by a police officer. And what happens is that the grocery stores go and get looted. Now, what did the grocery stores have to do with this? So the effect is the grocery stores, they move out. They say, hey, look, it's not possible to generate enough profit to operate in these locations. And then you fast forward years later, and then now there's no grocery stores in that neighborhood. And what's the media say? The media says that, there's systematic racism against Black communities because there isn't any grocery stores. There's food deserts. But there's an economic reason behind this. They create the problem and they suffer the consequences. Then they go back and they blame other people for the problem that they created. This is the problem with this movement, is that, again, they're propagating things that are only to the detriment of their own community. Here's another one from the Black Lives Matter website as far as their objective. It says, we foster a queer affirming network When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual. Really, is the average African American in America waking up each morning and saying, you know what, I really wish we didn't have such a tight grip of heteronormative thinking in American society? Of course not. This is something that has to do with the founders of Black Lives Matter movement. They self-identify as queer, atheist, Marxist revolutionaries. This is what they want to propagate, and they're using the masses under a noble cause in order to propagate their hate, in order to propagate their destruction of the nuclear family, to push this atheistic agenda. And we shouldn't be complacent in this. We should, it's not going to be popular, but we have to distinguish between Black lives and the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, where does it end? There was an article that's written, said the cult of dynamic wokeness is that there is no end. There is no point where you say, okay, we're redeemed, we're happy, everyone's living together. There is no, no more hard feelings. It says you must understand racism and admit that you cannot understand racism. You must admit your complicity in racism and pledge to do better, knowing that it's impossible to do better. You must be an ally, but accept that you will always do your allyship wrong, that there's nothing you can do to appease people. That they're always going to find something else to complain about. And you see this, that in the past, they would complain saying, hey, look, these Confederate statues have to go. And they get rid of them. Then they say, you know what? Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they have to go too. And eventually they're toppling over statues of abolitionists, people who were protecting the rights of human beings. That you realize this has nothing to do with racism in society, has nothing to do with treating people fairly and equitably. It has everything to do with destroying the American fabric, to destroy the political system that we have in place in order to foster a brand new revolution. One of the things that I find so disappointing is how Americans as a whole, they've become so unappreciative of this country despite so many blessings that we have here. You think about the millions of people from all over the world. They did a poll, I believe it's about 170 million people would love to be able to migrate, to immigrate to the United States. And these are from some of the countries that are the most desolate. These are from African countries. These are from Asian countries. People that they realize, they say, okay, look, there might be some racism here, but it's way better than what is taking place in Africa. I mean, this is a fact that an African American has better opportunity than anyone in Africa. Because if you look, the outflow of Africa to the US is tremendous. There's probably tens of millions of individuals every year trying to migrate to the United States from Africa. How many people from the United States are trying to migrate to Africa? Despite having the greatest country in the world, having the most diversity in the world, having the most opportunity for foreigners in the world, giving more money per capita to other individuals in the world, the amount of charity that Americans give is like an order of magnitude than the next country. I believe it's like 10x more than what Germany gives. And this is per capita. These things, it shows just how amazing of a country we have. Yet, you have individuals who believe we live in the most racist, tyrannical country in the world. It's beyond crazy. For the last 10 years, the US every year is the most desirable country for people to move into. What's funny is people outside the country, they view that what happened to George Floyd, these one-off cases, are the common occurrence in the US. And thank God these are rare occurrences. But then people treat as if this is happening all the time, which it isn't. The statistics prove this. Every time it happens is an absolute tragedy, but it's different to say that this is systematic racism. God warns us of a society that becomes unappreciative. In Surah 16, verse 112, it says, God cites the example of a community that used to be secure and prosperous with provisions coming to it from everywhere. But then it turned unappreciative of God's blessings. Consequently, God caused them to taste the hardship of starvation and insecurity. Such is the record for what they did. We have such a huge blessing that we have this country that is the world power that is able to establish freedom of opportunity, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. I cannot go and practice my religion comfortably in any other country, pretty much. If I go to the Middle Eastern country, they would run me out. They would banish me. They'd throw me into jail. If I go to China and try to pray in public, I would get thrown in jail. I've had people, Muslims, who were in China trying to do their salat and they got stopped by police. And if it wasn't for the tour guide, they would be in jail right now. How did this happen? How did we get to this state? And the sad thing is it has to do with the mentality of people. People often point to historic laws in America that either intentionally or unintentionally negatively impacted Black Americans as a sign of systematic racism in our country today. I would make the following two counterpoints to why I see this argument as fundamentally flawed. The first is the fact that these laws, thank God, were overturned years ago, is evidence that American society today is not systematically racist. And secondly, regarding the lasting effect of these policies as proof for systematic racism, I'd make the following argument. We can always blame our circumstances based on past injustices, but it's an ineffective strategy to better ourselves. This kind of mentality creates population that is despondent and believes there's nothing they can do to improve their situation, and it fosters a victim mentality. Therefore, I'm going to argue that it's the mentality towards bad policies that existed in the past that is the root of the problem and not the lasting effects of these old overturned policies. Proof of this is the millions of immigrants who have come to the US during this time with less education, less money, skills, status, and less concept of the language, the culture than Americans who grew up here. But why is it that immigrants who start off in so much worse of a situation are consistently able to become the upper echelon of society in the US? I mean, thank God we see people who come from the slums of other parts of the world come to the US and become some of the most wealthy, highest status individuals. For all intents and purposes, if there was systematic racism, then people who are immigrants to the US, like Nigerian Americans, should be just as much negatively impacted, if not more so, than American citizens who do not have this extra baggage. But we see that Nigerian Americans are one of the most successful demographics in American society. What's the difference? They have the same color of skin. They have the same quote-unquote systematic racism against them. It's the mentality that's different. In every population, there are two kinds of people. One group of people believe that if they work hard, they can better their situation. The other group of people believes that their lives are dependent on the structural problems and they have little control over. My problem with the arguments like this is that they put a disproportionate amount of blame on external factors that they can't control and not nearly enough responsibility upon themselves in the multitude of aspects that they can't control. I would say in any situation, 90% of a person's problems can be resolved by working on themselves. And 10% is going to be at odds with you. But rather than focus on the 90% of what we can each individually fix, we all want to fix that 10% that's external. Since I'm already this far into the political discussion, I might as well go all the way. There's a fundamental difference among Democrats and Republicans in their viewpoints on life and how to be successful. And this was done by Pew Research, and it said that, for instance, the majority of Republicans, 78%, say most people can get ahead if they work hard, while only 22% of Democrats believe the same thing. Additionally, while a majority of Republicans, 60%, say they believe that different choices in life contribute to a great deal to the income inequality, only 27% of Democrats believe the same thing. That you see consistently, Republicans believe that their outcomes are dependent on their choices, but you'll see that among Democrats, they believe that no, it's society that dictates their outcomes. And this change in perspective is what distinguishes between individuals who are successful from those who aren't. Because someone who, say, for instance, believes that there's no chance for them, there's no hope for them, they're never going to work to better their situation. I can go to a developing country right now and talk to individuals, and the vast majority of people, if you ask, why are you in such dire conditions, they're going to say that it's because of the system, that it's working against them. But you can find that same ethnicity here in the United States, and they're highly successful. What's the difference? Is their mentality was different. The individual who believed that they could better their situation by God's leave got up and moved. They went against the grain. They basically worked hard, and they believed that if they did so, God would reward them, and that's what we see. Republicans are also more likely than Democrats to see people working harder than others as a major contributor to inequality, while 48% say that, look, this has to do with how hard the individual worked. 22% of Democrats believe that working hard is a variable into being successful. And that's a huge issue. You say, hey, if you could give a message to millions of people who are impoverished, who are in tough situations, and the message is either, hey, the system is rigged against you, give up, or no, you work hard, you make good choices, then you're guaranteed by God's leave that you will be more successful than you are now. Which one would you want to propagate? Because right now what the BLM movement wants to say is that, look, you're hopeless. There's nothing you can do. The only thing that you have left is to revolt, to cause this revolution, to tear everything down. And what happened? This is my last bit that we got here. This is going to get, deep into the political aspect, but I can't help myself at this point. So in 2011, we had Occupy Wall Street. And Occupy Wall Street was basically found that people said, look, it was unfair that in 2008, all these banks, all these billionaires, they all got bailed out. And then who got left holding the bag? The average person. And they were right in their sentiment. The problem they had is that they could not garner political support. They could not garner corporation support, money, in order to further the cause, because their very cause was against the politicians and the money and the interest. And that's a sad state of affairs, but that's the reality. How are you going to promote, in essence, someone whose objective is to diminish your status or your well-being? It's not going to happen. But in 2013, when the Black Lives Matter movement happened, what politicians realized was that, oh, wow, this is roughly the same demographic, but this one we can actually support. Why? Is because they are willing to take political support. They're willing to take funds and money. You see some of these founders of the Black Lives Matter movement or some of these prominent speakers getting paid $250,000 or $1 million as a consulting fee to some corporation. We're seeing hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars being funneled into the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, a Marxist revolution. And what happened? How did this come to be? It's because the politicians realized that if they got in bed with these individuals, it gave them certain support. And if you see, it's predominantly Democrats. It's because these areas that are the most heavily affected with inequality, with dissatisfied constituencies, are in Democratic strongholds. Now, rather than admit their policies utterly failed, that they've utterly failed their constituency, what they want to say is that, no, this is systematic racism. And it allowed them to give cover to their terrible policies while being able to jump on the bandwagon to get their support. And now what's going on is that you're seeing that, look, these people have made a pact with the devil because everything that they propagate is completely against what the Quran has. They want an atheistic, queer-centric society that is completely against freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, constitutional law, law and order, that they want to tear all that down and create their quote-unquote Marxist utopia, which always leads in the death and lives of millions of people being uprooted, being torn apart. But what happened is that they got in bed with them, and now they're basically taking over. They realize that they have way more clout, way more power than they thought they did. They thought that, hey, if we could just get on the bandwagon, we can use them as a propagation to get Trump out of office, then we'll take control. And we're seeing that they're utterly failing. The other day in Wisconsin, a gay Democratic 60-year-old senator was mauled by a mob of people, and he was a Black Lives Matter supporter because he was filming them toppling some of these statues. This is no longer a peaceful protest. This has nothing to do with the well-being of Black Americans. This is a revolution. And there's a quote from Mark Twain. It says, "It's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled." And this is what we're seeing right now. People, they bought into this narrative. They bought into this bandwagon. And despite what we show them, despite what evidence they see, they're in disbelief to what's taking place. In Surah 2, verse 204 through 206, it reads, "Among the people, one may impress you with his utterances concerning this life, and may even call upon God to witness his innermost thoughts, while he is the most ardent opponent. As soon as he leaves, he roams the earth corruptingly, destroying properties and lives. God does not love corruption. When he is told, 'Observe God,' he becomes arrogantly indignant. Consequently, his only destiny is hell. What a miserable abode." This is what people are doing. They're putting this facade that their intentions are noble, that they're fighting for a good cause. But it only takes a little detective work to realize their true motivations. So let's not be fooled by these poets. God tells us in Surah 26, verse 221 through 226 says, "Shall I inform you upon whom the devils descend? They descend upon every guilty fabricator. They pretend to listen, but most of them are liars. As for the poets, they are followed only by the strayers. Do you not see that their loyalty shifts according to the situation, and that they say what they do not do? These individuals are promising one thing and delivering something else. And the vast majority of people are following them blindly. In 6:116 it reads, if you obey the majority of people on earth, they will divert you from the path of God. They follow only conjecture. They only guess. God willing, we're going to end there, but I'm going to link to a clip. This is from a person, his name is Yuri Bezmenov. He was a defector from Russia, communist Russia, the KGB, and he's talking about how the socialist movement uses subversion as a tactic to cause a revolution. And this was recorded in 1984, and he says it takes a generation, 30 years, for this to come to practice. Now, we're just about that time, so I think it's very relevant. But as always, if you guys got comments, questions, please hit us up at QuranTalk@gmail.com. If you guys want to read a translation of the Quran, check out the Quran Study app on the iOS App Store. We do a word-for-word literal translation of the Quran along with a great translation for the verse. We also have the website, QuranStudyApp.com. And now here's the clip from Yuri Bezmenov.
Well, you spoke several times before about ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets used the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There is no mystery. There is nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage intelligence gathering looks more romantic. It sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type of thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people who've been programmed and, as you say, in place and
Yes.
who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept, these are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. They will join the links of dissenters, dissidents.
Yes.
Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. Here you can get popular like Daniel Ellsberg and filthy rich like Jane Fonda for being dissident, for criticizing your Pentagon. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody is going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be a greatest shock for them, of course. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. So basically America is stuck with demoralization, and unless, even if you start right now, here, this minute, you start educating new generation of Americans, it will still take you 15 to 20 years to turn the tide of ideological perception of reality back to normalcy and patriotism. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, it doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world, that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. He will go to Moscow to kiss the bottoms of new generation of Soviet assassins. Never mind. He will create false illusions that the situation is under control. Situation is not under control. Situation is disgustingly out of control. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. The United States is in the state of war. Undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system. And the initiator of this war is not Comrade Andropov, of course. It's the system. However ridiculous it may sound, the world communist system or the world communist conspiracy, whether I scare some people or not, I don't give a hoot. If you are not scared by now, nothing can scare you. But you don't have to be paranoid about it. What actually happens now, that unlike myself, you have literally several years to live on unless the United States wake up. The time bomb is ticking, that every second the disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect to, unless you want to live in Antarctica with penguins. This is it. This is the last country of freedom and possibility.
Okay, so what do we do? What is your recommendation to the American people?
Well, the immediate thing that comes to my mind is, of course, there must be a very strong national effort to educate people in the spirit of real patriotism, number one. Number two, to explain them the real danger of socialist, communist, whatever, welfare state, big brother government. If people will fail to grasp the impending danger of that development, nothing ever can help United States. You may kiss goodbye to your freedom, including freedoms to homosexuals, to prison inmate. All this freedom will vanish, evaporate in 5 seconds, including your precious lives. The second thing, the moment at least part of United States population is convinced that the danger is real, they have to force their government. And I'm not talking about sending letters, signing petitions, and all this beautiful, noble activity. I'm talking about forcing United States government to stop aiding communism. Because there is no other problem more burning and urgent than to stop the Soviet military-industrial complex from destroying whatever is left of the free world. And it is very easy to do. No credits, no technology, no money, no political or diplomatic recognition, and of course no such idiocy as grain deals to USSR. The Soviet people, 270 millions of Soviets, will be eternally thankful to you if you stop aiding a bunch of murderers who sit now in Kremlin and whom President Reagan respectfully calls government. They do not govern anything, least of all such complexity as the Soviet economy. So basic, two very simple, maybe too simplistic answers or solutions, but nevertheless they are the only solutions. Educate yourself, understand what's going on around you. You are not living at the time of peace. You are in a state of war, and you have precious little time to save yourself. You don't have much time, especially if you are talking about young generation. There's not much time left for convulsions to the beautiful disco music. Very soon it will go, just overnight. If we are talking about capitalists or wealthy businessmen, I think they are selling the rope on which they will hang very soon. If they don't stop, if they cannot curb their unsettled desire for profit, and if they keep on trading with the monster of the Soviet communism, they are going to hang very soon. And they will pray to be killed, but unfortunately they will be sent to Alaska probably to manage industry of slaves. It's simplistic. I know it sounds unpleasant. I know Americans don't like to listen to things which are unpleasant. But I have defected not to tell you the stories about such idiocies as microfilm, James Bond type espionage. This is garbage. You don't need any espionage anymore. I have come to talk about survival. It's a question of survival of this system. You may ask me, what is it in for me? Survival, obviously, because as I said, I am now in your boat. If we sing together, we'll sing beautifully together. There is no other place on this planet to defect to.